The airport was crowded, filled with people rushing to their flights. Among them was a little girl named Emma, holding her father's hand tightly. She had big, curious eyes and a small smile on her face. It was her first time flying, and she was excited. Her father, Mr. Carter, walked beside her, dressed in simple clothes. Nothing fancy, just comfortable. No one would guess who he really was. As they reached the boarding gate, the flight attendant, Ms. Linda, glanced at them. She had been working for the airline for years, and she thought she could tell which passengers were important and which ones were not. Seeing Emma's simple dress and slightly worn shoes, she quickly assumed that they were ordinary people, maybe even traveling on a discount ticket. She didn't smile at them like she did with the well-dressed passengers. Instead, she barely looked at them as she checked their tickets. When they stepped onto the plane, Emma's eyes widened with excitement. The seats were big and comfortable, and everything looked fancy. "Daddy, this is so nice," she whispered, her face lighting up. Mr. Carter smiled and nodded. He loved seeing his daughter happy. But before they could settle in, Emma struggled to put her small backpack in the overhead bin. She was too short to reach it. She turned to Ms. Linda, who was standing nearby, and politely asked, "Excuse me, can you help me, please?" Ms. Linda sighed loudly, as if Emma had just asked her to do something exhausting. Without a word, she grabbed the bag and shoved it into the compartment, rolling her eyes. "You should have packed lighter," she muttered under her breath, but just loud enough for Emma to hear. Emma's smile faded. She didn't understand why the lady was being rude to her. Mr. Carter noticed everything. He watched Ms. Linda carefully but said nothing. Instead, he placed his hand on Emma's shoulder, reassuring her. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said gently, guiding her to their seats. They sat in first class, where passengers usually receive the best service. But Ms. Linda seemed surprised to see them there. As more passengers boarded, Ms. Linda greeted them with big smiles and a friendly voice. But whenever she walked past Emma and her father, her expression changed. She barely acknowledged them, as if they didn't belong there. A few minutes later, Emma felt thirsty. She looked around and saw that other passengers were getting drinks. She politely called out, "Excuse me, can I have some juice, please?" Ms. Linda turned slowly, her lips pressed together. She walked over, grabbed a small juice box, and placed it on Emma's tray with a little too much force. Some juice splashed onto the tray. "There," she said, without even apologizing. Then she walked away, ignoring the confused look on Emma's face. Emma looked at her father, unsure if she had done something wrong. Mr. Carter gave her a warm smile. "You did nothing wrong," he whispered. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He had seen everything. Other passengers began to notice the way Ms. Linda was treating Emma. Some exchanged glances, but no one said anything. They didn't want to cause trouble. A while later, a flight attendant came around with blankets for the passengers. Emma felt a little cold and saw that others were getting warm blankets. She politely asked, "Can I have one too, please?" Ms. Linda looked at her and smirked. "Blankets are for premium passengers," she said. Emma blinked in confusion. "But we're in first class," she said softly. Ms. Linda crossed her arms. "Well, they're limited, and we have to make sure the right people get them first," she said in a sharp tone. Emma lowered her eyes, feeling embarrassed. She pulled her small jacket around herself, trying to stay warm. Mr. Carter exhaled slowly, still silent, but his fingers tapped lightly on the armrest. He wasn't angry, at least not yet, but he was watching. Ms. Linda walked away, feeling pleased with herself. To her, Emma and her father were just ordinary people who somehow got lucky to sit in first class. She didn't know the truth. She didn't know who Mr. Carter really was. And she had no idea what was about to happen next. "You said." The plane took off smoothly, soaring into the sky. Emma sat quietly beside her father, looking out of the window. She should have been excited, but something felt wrong. The way Ms. Linda treated her made her feel small, as if she didn't belong there. Ms. Linda walked past them again, carrying a tray of drinks. She smiled at the passengers in the first few rows, offering them a selection of juices and soft drinks. But when she reached Emma's row, her smile faded. She didn't even ask if they wanted anything. Emma hesitated, then gathered the courage to speak. "Excuse me, can I have some water, please?" Ms. Linda turned to her with a fake smile. "Oh, you again," she said, almost sighing. She reached for a glass of water, but didn't bother to be careful. As she placed it down, a few drops spilled onto the tray. "Oops," she said without any real apology, then turned away before Emma could say anything. Emma wiped the tray with a napkin and took a small sip of water. She didn't want to complain, but she felt uncomfortable. Why was this lady being so rude? She had done nothing wrong. Mr. Carter watched everything. His expression remained calm, but there was a cold sharpness in his eyes. He didn't like seeing his daughter treated this way. But for now, he stayed quiet. A few minutes later, Ms. Linda returned to serve meals. She handed out beautifully plated dishes to other passengers, smiling as she placed their trays gently in front of them. When she reached Emma, her smile disappeared. She pulled a tray from the cart and placed it down carelessly. "Here," she said flatly. Emma looked at her plate. The food didn't look as nice as the other passengers' meals. It seemed like she had been given a smaller portion, and it wasn't even arranged properly. She looked around and saw that everyone else's food looked perfect. Emma glanced at her father, but he only nodded, silently telling her it was okay. She picked up her fork and started eating, even though she no longer felt very hungry. Ms. Linda walked away, smirking. She still believed they didn't belong in first class. She whispered to another flight attendant, "Some people don't know their place." The other flight attendant looked uncomfortable. "Maybe they're important guests," she said softly. Ms. Linda scoffed. "Please, look at them. That little girl is dressed like she got her clothes from a bargain store. And the father probably saved up for years just to sit here for once in his life." She laughed under her breath, shaking her head. She didn't realize that Mr. Carter had sharp ears. He had heard every word. Mr. Carter's fingers tightened around his fork. His patience was wearing thin, but he took a deep breath. He knew it wasn't time to reveal the truth yet. The plane continued its journey, and Emma tried her best to ignore Ms. Linda's cold treatment. But no matter how much she tried to pretend it didn't matter, she couldn't help but feel hurt. What had she done wrong? Why did that lady seem to dislike her so much? As the hours passed, Emma started feeling cold. She looked around again and noticed that all the other passengers had cozy blankets wrapped around them. She gathered her courage and spoke up. "Excuse me," she said softly, looking up at Ms. Linda. "May I have a blanket, please?" Ms. Linda frowned. "Blankets are for premium passengers," she said sharply. "They're not for everyone." Emma bit her lip. "But we—" "No excuses, little girl," Ms. Linda cut her off. "We don't have enough, so just sit tight." She turned on her heel and walked away without a second look. Emma swallowed hard, feeling embarrassed again. She pulled her small jacket tighter around her shoulders and hugged herself. Mr. Carter closed his eyes for a second, as if controlling his emotions. He glanced around and saw the other passengers shifting uncomfortably. They had witnessed the way Ms. Linda treated his daughter, and some even looked at him with sympathy. That's when a man sitting across the aisle leaned in. He was well-dressed and had a kind expression. "Excuse me," he said, looking at Ms. Linda. "Could I get an extra blanket for my daughter?" Ms. Linda nodded and smiled. "Of course, sir." She picked up a fresh blanket from the cart and handed it to the man's daughter. He didn't take it. Instead, he pointed at Emma. "Actually, I meant for her. She's cold." The smile on Ms. Linda's face disappeared instantly. She hesitated, looking between Emma and the man. She didn't know what to say. Other passengers were now paying full attention. Some of them were whispering to each other. Ms. Linda had no choice. Slowly, She handed the blanket to Emma. "There," she said, forcing a smile. "Happy now?" Emma took the blanket and smiled. "Thank you." She wasn't angry. She was just happy to be warm. Mr. Carter watched the whole thing and shook his head slightly. He knew the lesson wasn't over yet. The plane continued its journey through the night sky. Soon, it would land, and Ms. Linda would finally understand the truth. But by then, it would be too late. She had no idea what was coming next. The cabin lights dimmed, signaling that it was time to rest. Most passengers settled in, but Emma couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She held the blanket tightly around her, feeling a little warmer but still confused. What had she done wrong? Why did Ms. Linda treat her like that? Mr. Carter noticed his daughter's sad eyes. He leaned in and whispered, "You're special, Emma. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." Emma gave him a small smile, but she still felt uncomfortable. She wasn't used to people looking down on her. Meanwhile, Ms. Linda continued her work as if nothing had happened. She thought she had put the little girl in her place. She never liked it when people who didn't look rich sat in first class. It wasn't fair, she thought. Some people spent thousands to sit here, but then there were those, like Emma and her father, who somehow got in. She figured they had probably saved for years just for this one trip. As the flight continued, Emma started feeling restless. She stood up and stretched her legs, looking around the cabin. That's when she noticed Ms. Linda talking to a well-dressed couple. They were whispering, and Ms. Linda glanced over at Emma before laughing lightly. The little girl quickly looked away. Suddenly, there was a small jolt. The plane hit turbulence. The seatbelt sign lit up, and a voice came over the intercom, asking everyone to return to their seats. Emma hurried back and grabbed her father's hand. "It's just a little bumpy," he said. "Nothing to be scared of." She nodded, trying to be brave. But Ms. Linda walked by and sighed. "Oh, you're still awake. Just try not to make a scene, okay?" Emma pressed her lips together, not saying a word. She didn't understand why Ms. Linda kept acting like this. She had been polite, just like her father taught her to be. Why did the lady not like her? A few minutes later, Mr. Carter pressed the call button. Ms. Linda appeared, putting on another fake smile. "Yes, sir?" she asked. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor," he said calmly. Ms. Linda blinked. She wasn't expecting that. "Oh, about what, sir?" she asked nervously. Mr. Carter simply looked at Emma, then back at Ms. Linda. "Please, send them here," he said. The smile on Ms. Linda's face disappeared. She hesitated, looking around, but finally nodded and walked away. Emma turned to her father. "Daddy, is something wrong?" "Everything is fine, sweetheart," he said. "Just sit tight." Emma could feel that something big was about to happen, but she didn't know what. She looked around and noticed that some passengers were also paying attention. A few of them whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward Ms. Linda, who was now speaking nervously to a man in a suit, her supervisor. Within minutes, the supervisor, a middle-aged man in a sharp black suit, walked toward them. He had a serious expression. He stopped beside Mr. Carter's seat and leaned in slightly. "Sir," he said in a careful voice, "I understand there was a complaint." Mr. Carter looked up at him and smiled politely. "Yes, I would like to know why your staff treats certain passengers with more respect than others." Ms. Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she said quickly. "I didn't mean any harm. I treat all my passengers the same way." Mr. Carter leaned back in his seat. His face was calm, but his eyes held something unreadable. "Is that so?" he asked. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Passengers who had been watching held their breath. Ms. Linda's hands shook as she tried to explain herself. I mean, she stuttered. "It's just, some passengers, they expect more, and others, they should understand their place." Mr. Carter's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "And what place is that, exactly?" he asked. Ms. Linda's confidence started to fade. "Well, Sir, people like you. People like me. Mr. Carter interrupted. His voice was still calm, but there was a sharpness in his tone. Ms. Linda swallowed hard. I mean, some people, some guests, just, they don't belong in first class. For a moment, there was silence. Passengers turned in their seats, listening. Ms. Linda's face grew red as she realized how loud her voice had been. The supervisor's eyes narrowed. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slid something across the tray table. It was a sleek black card with his name and title written in gold. Ms. Linda's face turned pale as she read it. It was his airline. He was the owner. She had just insulted the man who could fire her with a single word. Her breath hitched in her throat. The tray in her hands shook. How could this be? How could this man, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, be the billionaire owner of the entire airline? Mr. Carter's eyes were calm, but now there was something else in them. A look that said he was waiting for an explanation. Ms. Linda's heart pounded. Everyone was watching her now. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She had made a terrible mistake. The plane was still cruising through the sky, but inside the first-class cabin, the air was heavy with tension. A nervous silence had fallen over the passengers as all eyes turned to Ms. Linda. Her face had gone pale, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the sleek black card Mr. Carter had handed her. It wasn't an ordinary credit card. It wasn't a simple ID. It was an executive card. It had the airline's logo printed in gold, along with a name that sent shivers down her spine. Mr. Jonathan Carter, CEO of Skylux Airlines, the airline's owner. For a few seconds, Ms. Linda didn't move. It was like she had stopped breathing. Then she slowly looked up at Mr. Carter, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Emma sat beside her father, hugging the blanket around her shoulders, her big eyes looking up at Ms. Linda with quiet curiosity. Mr. Carter took a sip of water before speaking again, his voice calm but firm. You didn't know who I was. That much is clear. He placed the card back in his pocket. But now that you do, let me ask you again. Why did you treat my daughter like that? Ms. Linda swallowed hard. Yes, sir, I didn't mean to. I don't need excuses, he interrupted. His eyes darkened, and his voice turned cold. I need an explanation. The other passengers were silent. Some of them were trying to act like they weren't listening, but everyone had stopped what they were doing. Even the other flight attendants stood frozen nearby, waiting to see what would happen. Ms. Linda fumbled with her hands. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize that she was my daughter. Mr. Carter finished her sentence for her. And what if she wasn't? Would that have made a difference? Ms. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had no answer. Emma looked up at her father. His voice was still calm, but she could tell he was disappointed. The supervisor cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, I deeply apologize for this. We hold our staff to the highest standard, and this is unacceptable. He turned to Ms. Linda with a cold expression. You are dismissed from your duties immediately. Ms. Linda's eyes widened. Wait. No, please, sir. It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to be rude. I didn't know. You treated a child unfairly because you assumed she didn't belong here. Mr. Carter interrupted again. That's not how we treat our passengers, no matter who they are. Ms. Linda's face turned red with shame. She looked around, hoping for someone to help her, but the other passengers avoided her gaze. She had been caught. Tears filled her eyes as she stammered. Please, sir, I need this job. Mr. Carter sighed and shook his head. I believe everyone should be treated with kindness, no matter how they look. You had the chance to do the right thing, and you chose not to. I cannot have someone like that on my team. With that, the supervisor gestured toward the back of the plane. Go take your seat in economy, Miss Linda. You'll be escorted off the plane when we land. Ms. Linda, speechless and humiliated, slowly turned and walked away. The other passengers whispered among themselves. Some nodded, as if they agreed with Mr. Carter's decision. Emma watched in surprise. She didn't understand everything, but she could tell something big had just happened. She tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, what just happened?" Mr. Carter turned to her and gave her a warm smile. He gently took her small hand in his and squeezed it. "I just wanted her to understand that kindness is for everyone, my love. It doesn't matter if you wear simple clothes or expensive ones. It doesn't matter if you're young or old. No one should be treated badly." Emma's eyes widened. "But how did she know you're the boss?" Mr. Carter chuckled. "Because I showed her my card." He held it up for her to see. It was black, with his full name written in gold. Emma stared at it, realization dawning in her eyes. "That's your company?" "Yes," he said with a small nod. "And I was watching how she treated you this whole time." A passenger sitting nearby clapped. Then another joined in. Soon, the entire first-class cabin was filled with the sound of applause. Emma looked around, shocked. The people she had thought were ignoring her were actually paying attention. Ms. Linda turned to face them, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands clenched at her sides as her face turned red. She wanted to disappear. The supervisor looked at her one last time. "I will speak to you after we land," he said firmly. "For now, please take a seat." Ms. Linda swallowed hard and nodded. She walked quickly to the back of the plane, her head hanging low. No more rude remarks. No more cold stares. The power had shifted. Emma turned to her father, her voice soft. "You didn't have to do that, Daddy." Mr. Carter smiled gently. "No one deserves to be treated the way she treated you," he said. "It's not about being rich or poor, Emma. It's about respect. Every person on this plane paid for their ticket. It doesn't matter who they are or what they wear. Kindness should be given to all." Emma looked down at her small hands, thinking. Then she smiled. She understood now. "Does this mean she's going to lose her job?" Her father sighed. "That depends on her. Everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is if we learn from them." Emma nodded slowly. She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing. Her father was someone important, not because of his money, but because he was kind. And that made her proud. Ms. Linda, now looking scared, sat in the back of the plane, biting her lip. The realization of her mistake weighed on her heavily. She had judged them too quickly, and now she was facing the consequences. But the flight was not over yet, and soon the entire crew would learn the full truth about Mr. Carter. Ms. Linda sat stiffly in her new seat, her hands trembling in her lap. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, their whispers floating through the cabin like a cold breeze. Just moments ago, she had been in charge, walking with confidence. Now she was just another passenger, powerless. Mr. Carter remained calm, his arm wrapped around Emma as she rested her head against him. The little girl yawned. She was tired, but she could feel something was different. The woman who had been so rude to her was now gone. The pilot's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at 35,000 feet and will be landing in about an hour. I would also like to take a moment to extend a special welcome to a very important passenger on board today." Ms. Linda turned her head, her heart racing. "It is an honor to have Mr. Jonathan Carter with us today," the captain continued. "For those of you who may not know, Mr. Carter is the owner of this airline, and we are always grateful for his leadership." A murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers looked over at Mr. Carter in shock. Others smiled at him with admiration. Ms. Linda's stomach dropped. The owner of the airline had been sitting just a few feet away from her this whole time. The same man she had treated with disrespect. She felt like she was going to faint. Meanwhile, Emma was still trying to understand everything. She had always known her father was important, but this was different. People were whispering, staring at them with wide eyes. A couple in the row ahead of them even smiled and nodded. Then, out of nowhere, A flight attendant appeared with a tray. "Mr. Carter, we apologize for any inconvenience. We have prepared a special meal for you and your daughter. Please, enjoy." The tray was full of the best food: a perfectly grilled steak, golden brown bread rolls, and a small plate of expensive chocolates. The same Ms. Linda had refused to serve them earlier. As the flight attendant placed the meal in front of Emma, she smiled kindly. "We also have a surprise for our young guest." She turned and took something from a small cabinet behind her. When she turned back, she held a beautiful chocolate cake with white frosting and a small candle on top. "A little treat for our special young guest today." Emma's eyes went wide with happiness. "Wow," she whispered. She turned to her father. "Is this really for me?" Mr. Carter smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." Emma's tiny hands shook as she reached for the fork. No one had ever done something this nice for her on an airplane before. She felt like a real princess. She looked around the cabin again. The passengers were still watching, but now their eyes were softer. Some were smiling. One woman even gave her a thumbs up. Ms. Linda, however, was frozen in place. She knew this was it. She had lost her job. She would have to start over. Just as she was about to turn and leave the cabin forever, Mr. Carter's voice stopped her. "Ms. Linda," he said. She turned back to him slowly, holding her breath. "I believe in second chances," he said. "If I let you go right now, what would you do differently next time?" Ms. Linda's lips trembled. She had never expected such words. She had expected him to be angry, to fire her on the spot. But instead, he was giving her a chance. A second chance. Tears welled up in her eyes. I would be kind, sir," she whispered. "I would treat everyone with the same respect, no matter what they wear or how they look." Mr. Carter nodded. "That's all I wanted to hear." He turned to the pilot. "She can keep her job." A collective sigh of relief went through the cabin. Ms. Linda gasped. "Sir, thank you. Mr. Carter held up his hand. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just prove me right." Ms. Linda swallowed hard and nodded. She looked at Emma, guilt in her eyes. I'm sorry, Miss Emma. I was wrong. I hope you can forgive me." Emma looked at her father. He smiled at her, a knowing look in his eyes. She hesitated, then nodded. "It's okay." And with that, Ms. Linda stepped away, humbled and silent. The rest of the flight went smoothly. Emma ate her cake, feeling special for the first time since she had stepped onto the plane. She smiled as she looked out the window, watching the fluffy clouds float by. Little did she know, the most surprising moment of the trip was still ahead. The plane continued its smooth journey through the sky. Emma, now happy and relaxed, enjoyed her special cake while leaning against her father. She felt warm and safe, knowing her father had stood up for her. Ms. Linda had quietly returned to her duties, moving carefully around the first-class cabin. She seemed different now, no longer the proud, sharp-tongued flight attendant who had spoken so rudely before. Instead, she was quiet, polite, and careful with every passenger she interacted with. Mr. Carter watched her from his seat. He had given her a second chance, but he wasn't sure if she truly deserved it. People didn't change overnight. Or did they? Suddenly, the entire plane shuddered. The lights flickered for a brief moment before returning to normal. Passengers tensed, looking around. Some whispered nervously. Even the flight attendants exchanged glances. "Dad?" Emma grabbed his hand. "What was that?" Mr. Carter squeezed her little fingers, keeping his voice calm. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just a bit of turbulence." But he knew something felt off. He glanced at the nearest flight attendant, who was whispering urgently into her earpiece. A few seconds later, the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but please remain calm. We have everything under control." Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed. Something in the captain's voice wasn't right. There was tension, maybe even worry. He knew that pilots were trained to stay calm no matter what. But there was something about the way he spoke, something that made Mr. Carter's stomach tighten. A few minutes passed. Then, suddenly, the plane lurched again. A gasping sound came from the passengers as the aircraft trembled. Drinks spilled, luggage in the overhead compartments rattled, and the fasten seatbelt sign blinked again. "Daddy." Emma grabbed her father's arm. Her big eyes were wide with fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," Mr. Carter said, keeping his voice calm. He didn't want to scare her. He held her hand, squeezing it gently. "The pilot has everything under control." The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers again. But this time, there was no soothing reassurance. Instead, his voice was tight with tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered unexpected turbulence due to an engine malfunction. We are making an emergency landing. Please remain calm and follow all safety instructions from our crew." Gasps and whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers clutched their armrests. A woman started crying softly, while a man in the front row muttered a quiet prayer under his breath. Emma looked up at her father, her big eyes filled with fear. "Are we going to be okay?" Mr. Carter kept his face calm, but inside, worry twisted his stomach. He couldn't show his daughter that, though. "Of course, sweetheart," he said gently, brushing her hair back. "The pilots are well trained. Everything will be all right." The plane shook again, harder this time. People gasped. A loud beeping sound filled the cabin as one of the flight attendants grabbed a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. Keep your seatbacks upright and your tray tables locked. We are preparing for an emergency landing." The tension in the air was almost unbearable. A mother was holding her baby tightly, whispering a prayer. A man in a suit gripped the armrests of his seat so hard his knuckles turned white. A woman began to cry. Emma clung to her father. "I'm scared," she whispered. Ms. Linda stood near the front of the cabin, looking unsure of what to do. It was clear she wanted to hide, but she had a job to do. A job she was lucky to still have. She looked at Mr. Carter, her face full of shame and fear. Then the plane suddenly lurched. Screams filled the air as the aircraft shook violently. Oxygen masks dropped from above, and the flight attendants rushed to help passengers put them on. Ms. Linda swallowed her fear. She knew this was her chance to prove herself. Without hesitating, she moved quickly through the cabin, helping people secure their seatbelts and reassuring them with a firm but calm voice. She reached Emma and Mr. Carter. The young girl was clutching her father's hand tightly, her eyes wide with fright. "Sweetheart, it's going to be okay," Ms. Linda said softly, kneeling next to Emma. "I'm sorry for earlier. I should have been kinder to you." Emma looked up at her, still afraid but curious. "I was wrong," Ms. Linda admitted, "but I'm going to make sure you're safe." She took a deep breath and spoke louder so the whole cabin could hear. "Everyone, please remain calm. We have trained for situations like this. The captain is in control, and we will get through this together. Take slow, deep breaths and follow instructions." Something about the way she spoke made people feel a little better. The nervous whispers died down, replaced by quiet murmurs of reassurance. Then came another jolt. This time, it felt as if the entire plane had dropped several feet. Passengers screamed. The overhead compartments shook. A few loose bags tumbled to the floor. Emma shut her eyes and gripped her father's hand. She could hear the captain's voice, calm but firm. "We are making our descent now. Please remain in your seats." The plane shook again. Ms. Linda crouched down beside them, her eyes on Emma. "It's okay," she whispered. "We'll be landing soon." Mr. Carter held his daughter close. But then, something strange happened. Ms. Linda suddenly stiffened, her face turning white. She was staring toward the front of the plane, her hands gripping the seat. "Sir," she whispered to Mr. Carter. "Look." He followed her gaze and his stomach dropped. There was a man. A passenger from economy class was now in first class, standing near the cockpit door. He had a small black bag clutched tightly against his chest. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wild with fear, his breath fast and shallow. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Mr. Carter didn't know how or why, but every instinct in his body told him this man was about to do something terrible. And then, before anyone could react, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small device with a blinking red light. A bomb. The entire cabin fell silent in horror. Emma's small fingers squeezed her father's hand as the device beeped. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide, his hands trembling, but he held the device high. "Nobody move," the man said, his voice shaking. "If anyone tries anything, I swear I'll do it." Panic filled the air like a heavy cloud, and in that moment, it became clear this flight was in more danger than anyone had imagined. And the worst part, the bomb timer had already started ticking down. To be continued. The plane was silent. Time seemed to slow as every passenger stared at the man holding the small beeping device. His hand shook, his breath was heavy, and sweat dripped from his forehead. "Nobody move," the man shouted. His voice was trembling, but his grip on the device was tight. "I have a bomb. If anyone tries anything, I'll..." He took a deep breath. "I'll blow this plane up." Gasps and whispers thread through the cabin. A woman started sobbing. A flight attendant clutched her chest, her hands shaking. Mr. Carter pulled Emma close, shielding her with his arms. "It's okay, baby," he whispered. But deep inside, fear clenched at his heart. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for his little girl. The pilot's calm voice came over the speaker. "Sir, we don't want any trouble. Let's talk about this." The man shook his head frantically. "Shut up. Don't come near me." His face was pale, his hands trembling. "You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." At that moment, Ms. Linda did something that surprised everyone. Slowly, she took a step forward, raising her hands. Her voice was calm but firm. "Sir," she said gently, "I know you're scared, but I need you to listen to me." The man's eyes darted toward her. He was breathing heavily, clearly panicked. "Stay back," he warned. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will if I have to." Ms. Linda didn't flinch. She took another step closer, her hands raised. "I believe you," she said softly. "I can see that you're in pain. But hurting these people won't fix anything." The man hesitated, his breathing still fast. "They took everything from me," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I lost my job, my family, my home. No one cares." Ms. Linda swallowed hard, and then, for the first time, she truly understood. She had been given a second chance, but maybe this man felt like he never had one. "Sir," she said gently, her voice soothing, "I know how you feel. You feel like the world has turned its back on you, like nobody cares, like you're all alone." The man's eyes locked onto hers. His grip on the device loosened just a little. You don't know anything about me." Ms. Linda took a deep breath. "I know what it's like to feel lost," she said. "To think that the whole world is against you. But this is not the way. Please, let's talk." The man hesitated. His eyes filled with tears. Mr. Carter, still clutching Emma's hand, saw the fear in the man's face. He knew he had to do something. Carefully, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "You don't have to do this," Mr. Carter said calmly. "Tell me what's wrong. Maybe I can help." The man's hands trembled even more. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. He looked at the bomb in his hands, then at Emma, then at Mr. Carter. I just want someone to listen," he whispered. "I lost everything. My job, my family. No one cares. No one helps." "I care," Mr. Carter said softly. "Tell me what happened." Tears slipped down the man's cheeks. He looked around, as if realizing the fear he had caused. His grip on the detonator weakened. His body shook. His lips trembled. Then, in a sudden move, he fell to his knees, breaking into sobs. His hands loosened, and Ms. Linda quickly reached forward, taking the device from his hands. The other passengers gasped as she handed it to one of the pilots, who quickly took it to be defused. The man collapsed into the nearest seat, burying his face in his hands. He was crying, truly crying. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I just wanted someone to hear me." Mr. Carter let out a slow breath, then turned to his daughter. Emma's face was buried against his chest, but she peeked up at him. "Is it over?" she asked in a small voice. "Yes, sweetheart," Mr. Carter whispered, stroking her hair. "It's over." The plane landed safely an hour later, greeted by flashing police lights on the runway. Officers rushed in, taking the man away. The passengers burst into applause and cheers, relieved to have landed safely. Before leaving the plane, Ms. Linda approached Mr. Carter. She looked nervous, as if she had 1,000 words caught in her throat. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Sir," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Mr. Carter studied her. He could see the regret in her eyes, the exhaustion on her face. He gave a small nod. "Thank you for helping," he said simply. Ms. Linda bit her lip and looked at Emma. "I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about a lot of things." She hesitated, then said, "I hope one day you can forgive me." Emma looked at her father, then back at Ms. Linda. She thought about the way she had been treated earlier, how unfair it felt. But she also remembered how scared she had been during the emergency, how Ms. Linda had helped, how she had spoken softly, how she had been brave. Emma smiled a little and held out her hand. "It's okay. I forgive you." Ms. Linda's eyes filled with tears again, and she took Emma's small hand in hers. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Mr. Carter put a hand on Ms. Linda's shoulder. "Remember what you said," he told her. "You've got a second chance now. Use it well." With that, he lifted Emma into his arms and walked toward the exit. Passengers clapped as they left the plane. The little girl turned and waved at Miss Linda one last time. The flight attendant waved back, her lips quivering as she held back tears. As they stepped out into the bright sunlight, Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said, "do you think she will be okay?" Mr. Carter looked down at his daughter, then back at Miss Linda. He thought about second chances, about the kindness that had saved them all today. "I think," he said softly, smiling, "she will be just fine." And with that, he picked Emma up, held her close, and stepped forward into the warmth of the new day.